Now recording. So this is once again test review. Yesterday we covered basically exclusively JavaScript topics. We talked about basic JavaScript syntax. We talked about some of the differences between JavaScript and C#. We talked about event-based systems. We went over the document object model. That being said, if there's anybody here today that wasn't here yesterday, and there are any questions that might arise that any people in that category would like to have answered, I'm happy to go over those even if they review material from the previous class. Yes?
All I ask is please upload the video you took yesterday.
It's already in the queue. It will be uploaded at midnight.
Sounds good.
Yeah. If I'm to reconstruct the topic list from memory, I believe we also had some PHP topics on there. We had some SQL. I know we covered SQL this week, but still useful to review some of it. So, let's begin our discussion with AJAX requests. So, the way that we studied AJAX requests in this course was that we went through the jQuery library. It is also possible to perform AJAX requests in vanilla JavaScript, obviously, but the jQuery library is what we were using for that. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to pull the syntax up. And while I do that, I might make some comments about the permitted aids on the test. So similarly to the tests last semester, you are permitted to use one 8.5 by 11 crib sheet. You're also allowed to have a calculator that you don't need. Primarily for the purpose of having a comfort object. So it will be a written pen and paper test. I haven't decided whether we're going to be. The test is designed for 2 hours. I'm not convinced that we're going to have any class afterwards because I can't really teach after you've written a test. It just doesn't work, And at any rate, time has been made in the schedule to have a testing week. And it also, I can't really do a review session, 2 hours of review, then literally 2 hours of test. It's just, it's just not, Come on. There we go. So, recall that there are, as we've dealt with so far, two HTTP request methods. what are the two HTTP request methods?
Get and post.
Correct, get and post. So, when you are sending an AJAX request, what you are doing is generating an HTTP request which occurs after the initial page load. The initial page load will be initiated most frequently by typing a URL into the address bar or clicking on a link in some manner. AJAX queries also perform HTTP requests, but the big difference is they do not cause page reloads, and the object is usually not to load an HTML page. Normally, this is a way of transferring general data from the server to the client. Well, from the client to the server and then the server back to the client again. Because with both of these methods, we have the ability to attach parameters, right? If you remember our query parameters that end up in the URL when we make a URL request, we have, www.website.com / let's leave off the slash. The question mark indicates the beginning of the query parameters. Key 1 equals value 1, and key 2 is equal to value 2, etc. You guys remember this, right? This is the manner in which you can throw GET request parameters into a URL. This is a GET request. Of course, this isn't secure. The URL is not encoded. It has to be clearly visible in order for the packet to be routed through the network. So, post parameters are a way of sending information secretly inside of the encrypted payload. They don't appear here. Right? So, when we send information to the server, that information can take many forms. Maybe it's the particular YouTube video that you want to view. Maybe it is the maybe you're trying to log into a system and you're sending your username and password, right? YouTube videos, that's GET request because it doesn't matter if people know what video you're watching. Post for login credentials because it very much does matter if people know what your password is, right? We can initiate both of these types of requests using AJAX. So the first thing that you must know when creating an AJAX request in jQuery, you must know if you're sending a GET or a POST packet request. That takes one of two different forms. $.get or $.post. These are alternatives. Make sense? So, when we make an HTTP request, what are we requesting? What does the word request mean? What is the object of the request when we make an HTTP request?
A file?
A file, yes. You should think of the internet as one great big distributed file system, right? So when we make an HTTP request, whether it's through the URL or through a link or through an AJAX request, at least as far as we are currently, that's 100% of the time going to be a request for a specific file. Now, the web has, this is kind of the web classic description. Things have since evolved a little bit. We no longer, when we think about APIs, HTTP requests to APIs, we're not necessarily thinking about accessing a file, rather we are thinking about accessing a function. However, PHP scripts kind of form a sort of in-between state. Much of the time, when you perform an AJAX request, the thing you will be requesting is a PHP script. You are sending some information to a script that executes on the server, produces some data, and then sends it back to you. That's like, it's possible to do AJAX requests for just straight resources, like image files and that sort of thing. That's more rare, just because the browser is already very good at getting all of the images that you're going to need to render the web page. It's not usually necessary unless you're doing something a little out of the way, right? Dynamically loading images based on, like, you know, parameters, that sort of thing. It's the sort of thing a social media, like a modern social media feed will do, but anyway. So, when we make an AJAX request, there are 3 pieces of information that we need. The first is the file name on the server of the resource we are requesting. I'm going to give it a PHP file extension because, again, most of the time that's what you're going to be accessing via AJAX. Like, certainly within the context of this course. The file you are requesting. The next thing that you need to send is the data. It is not absolutely necessary that you send data whenever you are making an AJAX request, but you certainly need the ability to send data when making an AJAX request. So this information attached to the query parameter, as in the previous example, this needs some kind of iteration or interpretation within the context of our second argument. This is a set of key value pairs. JavaScript has a way that it likes to deal with key value pairs, and that is an object. So the way that we create JavaScript objects is as follows. We open them with a curly brace. We state the name of the key, what the key's name is. Close the quotes. We place the colon character. We then give it the value. We then use commas to separate however many key value pairs we have. Value, there we go, dot, dot, dot. And we close that with a closing curly brace. Does this make sense? So far, so good? Now, the final thing, so this is parameter 1. This is parameter 2 of the AJAX request. The third parameter is the quote-unquote callback function. The callback function executes when the AJAX query has received its response. It's very important to understand about AJAX queries that they do not happen instantaneously, right? It's not like I send out the AJAX query, I get the response back before I could execute one statement in JavaScript. We have to go out into the network to fetch these resources. The resources can be large, so the callback function is registered, and then it can be executed at any time once that packet receives it, once that request receives its response. This is called asynchronous programming. So, it's called asynchronous because it's not synced up, right? The callback function executes at some time that's guaranteed to be past the time when you executed the AJAX query. So, the question then is, what do we provide in terms of a callback function? Well, there are a few different alternatives. I'm going to talk about two main alternatives. The first is that you have a function defined elsewhere. For example, if we imagine that this is like in the same file, right? We might have function foo does something, right? Fine. We can provide just the function name in the same way that we provide just the function name when we are setting up an event listener, right? If you recall from yesterday, when we create an event listener, we want to pass a function reference. This means, what do we not include when we make a function reference rather than calling the function? What's the difference syntactically?
Brackets.
That's correct. So this, just to recap, immediately calls the function. This is a reference to the function. Reference to the function. Make sense? So in this case, we do not want to immediately call the function when we are passing it as a callback function. We want it to execute in the future. We therefore pass a function reference by not including the round braces. So, if you've defined all of this further down, this third parameter can be as simple as saying, stating the function name, foo. Let me put a big old comma there. Let me put a big old comma there. And then at the end of this, you close the statement. Alternatively, we can define an inline function, an anonymous function. The way that you define an anonymous function, pull that over here. The way that you define an anonymous function, you define it in place, so the function definition would go within the call to the AJAX function, and you define the function the way that you would normally. You omit the function's name, right? So instead of saying function foo, you simply say function. You leave it anonymous. Does that make sense? So, this is good insofar as it goes. Let me just put that onto the camera. There you go. Board 1, board 1, board 2, board 3. There you go. Hopefully people can pause the video. So, when we are defining the anonymous function, that might be a bit better. When we define the callback function for the AJAX request, this is the thing that executes once the AJAX request has been returned as a response. But this also means this thing is responsible for handling how the data sent from the server is handled, right? What do we do with it? Do we put it into the web page? Do we execute further requests because of that data? Who knows? That's what that function is meant to define. The AJAX request sends the data from the server to the function as its first argument. So, in both of these cases, we are taking that data and we are dumping it in the garbage, because we have not assigned a parameter inside of these braces to collect the information from the server. So what you actually want to do is you want to define things this way. You want to provide a named parameter. The word data is often used. If the response is JSON data, then JSON is sometimes used. Sometimes just RES for response is used here, right? Under this formulation, the information which is sent back from the server in the form of the AJAX response is assigned to the first parameter of the function. You can now use this inside of the function to do stuff. The most simple example, of course, being something like console.log data, which simply prints it to the JavaScript console. Make sense? Any questions about AJAX? Okay. Good. All right. Board 1, board 2, board 3. So I think that our next topic, it leads somewhat smoothly in from the last one. Shall we discuss how to pick information up in a PHP script that's been sent by the client? That's kind of the next step in the communication. PHP reading input. Does anybody want a picture of this before I erase it? PHP scripts. It might be useful to kind of review PHP in general terms before we get to the whole reading input stuff. So, in general terms, when an Apache server which has PHP installed, receives an HTTP request for a file with the file extension .php, the server takes that file and throws it into a program called the PHP interpreter. The PHP interpreter scans through the file looking for PHP code. Where it finds PHP code, it executes that PHP code and then removes that code from the file. So, according to the PHP interpreter, that's the worst question mark I've ever written in my life. Let's consider this to be the contents of a PHP file. ABC, echo D in a PHP script, EF. The way that the PHP interpreter interprets this file, it loads it up and says, that's not PHP, not PHP, not PHP. Oh, this is PHP. So it switches on PHP mode. It then executes all of the code inside of those tags. It then replaces that tag with whatever the echoed output of that tag is. So it says, if this is the file, then this is what gets put in the packet. It says A is in text mode, B is in text mode, C is in text mode. This is in PHP mode. What is PH doing? Execute echo D. Okay, I'm collecting the echoed output and putting it in the file. D. I end PHP mode and then I continue as normal. E and F. So, in the copy that gets sent to the client, all PHP code has been fully removed and replaced with other stuff. Now, that's not necessarily the case. Like, if the string itself contains a PHP tag, right, then it'll send that, right? But in general, like, why would you do that? Don't ever do that, right? So it's very, very important that no PHP code whatsoever touches the client. This means that PHP can hide our secrets, right? Very important secrets, like how to access the database that we're using. If you recall me talking yesterday about SQL injection attacks and how serious a problem those are, we must at all costs protect the integrity of the database. So when we put things like login credentials for our PHP server, or for our SQL server into PHP, we are guaranteed that they are not echoed to the client unless we are so stupid as to echo them to the client. Right? Make sense? So, PHP is a general programming language. It can do all of the stuff that C# or JavaScript can do. However, it's really made for being spliced into HTML files like this. So, when a PHP script receives parameters from the user, those parameters are placed into a couple of, like, it puts them in places that are always the same so you know where to find them, right? If you receive get parameters, it stores them in a thing called the get superglobal. The structure of this thing is actually exactly the same as the structure of the JavaScript object, which was the second argument of our AJAX query. It's a series of key value pairs. If the received request was a post request rather than a get request, then that same information is stored into the post superglobal. The superglobal arrays store the raw text which has been sent from the client. Now, a very, very, very important principle is that you never, ever, forever, never trust the client. The client is any rando on the internet. And these people, like most of them will be normal users, but occasionally you will get phenomenally stupid users who break things in very interesting ways, and very, very occasionally you will get hackers. You should assume that every user is a hacker, right? You should assume that you are always going to come across attempts to breach the integrity of your website. These guys store the data from the users in raw form. These can contain script attacks. Therefore, it is necessary to filter the inputs so that any script attacks are neutralized. This has the added benefit of confirming that the received parameters are type correct. Because JavaScript and PHP are not type-safe languages, they are dynamic, weakly typed languages, both of them. So everything I said about dynamic and weak typing yesterday also applies to PHP. PHP also has the triple equals operator, right? Because they are weak languages, that's a bit of a logical leap, but in my view, since I have a strong preference for strong typing, a weak language has weak typing in my view, but, you know, because you can't, like, and even if it didn't, the information which is being passed to you through HTTP is fundamentally stored in characters. These are big strings that we're throwing around, right? So if one of your parameters is expected to be an integer or a float, you could get a random string instead of that and nothing would say boo or hiss, right? Until you check the data type while filtering. So this is the line. Filter underscore input. We then have two alternatives. Either input underscore get or input underscore post. You need to know whether it is a get or a post response to be able to look in the right superglobal. If you are unsure whether your incoming request is a get or a post request, you should take a look at the HTML that you've written. The HTML or the JavaScript. The client will, like, it'll be obvious in the client whether you're sending get or post, and if it isn't, it's probably get, because that means that you forgot to set, like, the method attribute in a form, but that defaults to get. So, you know. In either event, if you just as a test, if you just echo back the JSON encoding of either of these things, you'll see where your input is, right? So you need to know input get or input post. The next thing you need to know is the key of the data that you're looking for. Remember that this data occurs in key value pairs. You need to know the key to get at the value. You need to say the key here in order for this to know what data inside of these things you're attempting to execute on. So, And by the way, the keys are not, they're certainly not required to be called key 1, key 2. I'm just using those as examples because it, it saves me the intellectual difficulty of having to come up with a specific example for all of this. I'm dealing in general terms. So after that, you need to describe what type of filter operation this is. There is a mapping. There are 4 of them that you need to know. Filter, validate, int, validation filter for integers. It verifies that the incoming value is in fact an integer. Filter, validate, float. Same thing as integer, but for floating point values. Filter, validate, bool for Boolean values. Interestingly, filter validate bool will actually, so this is actually possibly a more useful one than validate int and validate float, because it will produce a true or false value on the other end, but it will also take as normative inputs things like yes and no, and not just true and false. So there's actually a whole category of strings that correspond to a true and a false. You can look them up in the documentation if you're interested, but it's not just filtering true, false. And then the final one, filter sanitize string no. That one's deprecated. You guys know what deprecated means?
No.
Out of date. It means it's going to be, it's probably going to be dropped from PHP entirely in later versions. Anything that's deprecated, as a programmer, it means you shouldn't use it. It's in there for compatibility for a period of time, but it is a feature that, the powers that be have decided does more harm than good. So, filter sanitize string is deprecated. Don't use it. The one that you should use is filter sanitize special chars. You select whichever of these applies based on whether you're getting your information from get or post. You select whichever one of these applies based on the expected data type. Sound good? Let me just put that on camera for the benefit of anybody who's not in class. There we go. Zoom in maybe a little. There you go. Very good. So, of course, receiving these inputs is, so class, I think I have 8 minutes left in class. If there are any specific questions that you have about the material, this is your last chance. If not, I will continue talking. give you a moment to think about it while I erase this for you. Are there any specific questions about anything? Like, obviously, I'll still answer questions by email, but like, in terms of in-class time, this is your last chance. Yes?
Would there be any, like, about those, what's it called, tables? Like the one that we did, on,
SQL?
yeah, it's like PHP admin?
So SQL queries are covered on the test.
Okay.
In terms of like the material covered, in your studying, certainly review your basic CRUD operations and review the correct methodology for using the PDO object to send queries to the database in PHP. Again, like you don't have to have the actual connection code memorized, right? If you want to put it on your cheat sheet, I'm sure you'll find room for it, right? But like, my general expectation is not that you'll have like long segments of code, multiple lines of code that you just have to, you know, copy paste from memory. That's not a really effective way of testing, right? I'm more interested in whether you understand the material rather than have you memorized things by rote that you would have looked up in a different scenario. Question?
The practice midterm that's on my Canvas, did you do that or was it already there? And how useful will it be?
It is not of my production, but I have, I've kept reasonably close to the versions of the test which, that's Kevin Brown's material. I've kept with this test reasonably close to the versions of the test that Kevin did while he was teaching this course. So I would say that the practice midterm is highly representative. Obviously it doesn't contain the exact questions of the test or anything like that, but it's highly representative of scope, breadth, depth. So the scope of topics of the course that are coverable, the breadth and the breadth of those topics and how deeply we're interested in going into those topics in the context of a test. So yes, certainly like your one-stop shop almost for studying will be that practice midterm. Now, there is correct and incorrect use of the practice midterm. I highly encourage all of you to do the majority of your studying, reviewing notes, attempting practice problems, and creating your crib sheets before attempting the practice midterm. Attempt that practice midterm when you feel you would be ready for the real test. Because that way, it is an actual test of your ability, right? So, you know, use it to gauge your understanding of the material. Don't just rely on it to know what the material is going to be, right? That's what I would say is like optimal use of it. Certainly, at least you should have sorted out your crib sheet before you attempt it. And when you attempt it, keep your browser closed and work off of your crib sheet and your memory, because that is what you're going to have on the real test, right?
Is it only one attempt, do you know?
I gave you 999 attempts. I don't expect anybody to use them all, but you never know. Yeah, you can attempt the practice midterm as many times as you like. Effectively, you know what? If you want more attempts than that, I will email Canvas and say you need to increase the maximum limit on the number of test attempts on this. Honestly, the fact that it's like 999 actually is kind of like raising a lot, like red flags for me, because like if that were a variable, it should be something base 2, you know. But anyway, like like, why is that, that seems like such an arbitrary limit. Why would you limit it to 999, you know? Like, limit it to the size of an integer maybe, but anyway. Yeah, practice midterm is a good study option. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, 2 minutes left. So I think I can only just say what I was going to say to finish off this topic. The return result of filter input is important. If this key does not appear in the superglobal you're looking for it in, i.e. that data was never sent by the client in the first place, this thing returns null. If, when you're attempting to validate int, float, or bool, if you're attempting to do any of the validation filters, if the thing sent by the client is not the thing that it should be, this thing returns false. Now the difficulty is, in PHP, null and false equate to each other under weak equality. Null is double equals to false. However, that's why we've been provided the strong equality operator. Null does not triple equals false. So that's the inversion of that. Null, false, that yields false, this yields true. So basically, if you're not using strong equality, when you are trying to pick out what happened here, you're going to end up, you're going to fail. You're going to have things show up the way that they shouldn't. The other thing is that 0 also equates this way. So if you are trying to read an integer, and that integer has a valid value of 0, you will not be able to find it. Does that make sense? Any final questions? Well, in that case, have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you at the test. Board 1, Board 2, Board 3. Peace.